was supposed to be over by the time the leaves fell. That was the plan. Theft was the promise. In the summer of 1941, German military planners had calculated, with the kind of cold, bureaucratic confidence that only exists before reality arrives, that the Soviet Union would collapse within 6 weeks. Maybe 8, if things got complicated. The Wehrmacht rolled east in June with summer tunics, canvas boots, and supply lines built for a short campaign. Nobody packed for winter. Nobody ordered thermal underwear in bulk. Nobody, at the highest levels of the German military command, seriously planned for what would happen if the war was still going in November. It was still going in November. And then the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Not the kind of autumn chill that gives you time to adjust. By late October 1941, soldiers on the Eastern Front were reporting temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius. By December, in some sectors, it hit -40. Men who had been fighting in the same cotton uniforms since June, the same thin wool jackets, the same leather boots, were now facing conditions that would have killed an unprepared civilian within hours of exposure. Frostbite didn't announce itself. It started in the fingers, then the toes, then the nose and ears. By the time a man realized something was seriously wrong, the damage was already irreversible. Surgeons in field hospitals were performing amputations not because of bullets, but because of weather. Here's what makes this story so staggering, and why it has fascinated historians for decades. Some of them survived. Not just a handful. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers endured that first winter, arguably the most brutal conditions any modern army had ever faced, and lived to fight again in 1942. How? What does a man do when his own military has failed him so completely that survival itself becomes an act of personal improvisation? What does it actually look like, on the ground, in the mud and ice of the Russian winter, when the army runs out of answers and the individual soldier has to invent his own? That's what this video is about. Not the grand strategy. Not the generals arguing in warm rooms. The men in the trenches, in the snow, at -40, wearing summer uniforms, and the brutal, creative, desperate things they did to stay alive. It was November, and the German soldier standing in a trench outside Moscow was wearing the same jacket he had put on in Poland 5 months earlier. Let that sink in for a moment. 5 months. The same cotton wool blend tunic, the same leather boots with thin leather soles, the same standard-issue gloves designed for a Central European autumn, not for a Russian winter that would become one of the coldest in recorded history. The Wehrmacht's uniform, known as the Feldbluss, was a well-engineered piece of military clothing for the conditions it was designed for. Temperate Europe. Moderate cold. Short campaigns. It was, by every measure, completely wrong for what was happening now. The boots were perhaps the single most catastrophic failure. German standard boots in 1941 were made of leather, and leather, when wet, conducts cold directly into the foot. Russian winters don't just bring dry, sharp cold, they bring snow that melts against body heat and then refreezes. Soviet soldiers had been issued Valenki, traditional felt boots that had been refined over centuries of Russian winters. They were ugly. They were simple. They worked. German boots, by contrast, became rigid in extreme cold, cutting off circulation, turning feet into blocks of ice inside a leather shell. The German medical reports from that winter are almost clinical in their horror. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht was recording over 100,000 frostbite casualties. Some estimates put the number significantly higher. More men were being taken out of the fight by the cold than by Soviet bullets. The uniform itself told a similar story. The standard German field tunic had a wool content, but it wasn't built for layering. The cut was too fitted, too structured. Soldiers couldn't easily wear multiple layers underneath without losing mobility. And mobility, in combat, is survival. The greatcoat, the long wool overcoat that was part of standard issue, provided some protection, but it was heavy, it absorbed moisture, and it was never designed for sustained exposure at -30 or -40. When the temperature dropped far enough, even wool loses its insulating properties. The physics are unforgiving. At -40, the difference between surviving the night and not surviving it can come down to a single additional layer of trapped air between your skin and the outside world. German soldiers in the winter of 1941 often didn't have it. What happened to the human body under these conditions wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a systematic biological shutdown. Frostbite progressed in stages. First the skin blanched and went numb, a deceptive mercy that masked the damage underneath. Then came the deep tissue freeze, where ice crystals formed inside the cells themselves, rupturing them from within. Extremities went first: fingers, toes, ears, the tip of the nose. Men lost the ability to operate their rifles. Bolts froze shut. Triggers became impossible to pull with hands wrapped in improvised rags. And then there was hypothermia, the slow, almost peaceful descent in core body temperature that ended, if nothing intervened, in unconsciousness and death. Soldiers described men simply sitting down in the snow and not getting back up. Not wounded. Not shot. Just done. And yet the line held. Imperfectly, brutally, at enormous cost, but it held. Which raises the question that this video exists to answer: if the uniform failed, if the supply system failed, if the high command failed to even acknowledge the scale of the problem until it was almost too late, what exactly did these men do? The answer isn't one thing. It's a collection of solutions, each more desperate and inventive than the last, pieced together by men who had no other choice. And it starts underground. The ground itself became the first weapon against the cold. When you can't fight the temperature above the surface, you go below it. Soviet winters are brutal at the skin of the earth, but dig down far enough and something changes. The soil itself holds residual heat, not warmth by any comfortable definition, but enough of a difference to matter when the alternative is open exposure at -40. German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned this fast. Not from any manual or officer's briefing, but from the oldest teacher available, watching men die above ground and surviving below it. Trenches deepened. Dugouts multiplied. And what began as basic field fortifications evolved, over weeks of desperate improvisation, into something closer to an underground architecture of survival. The most effective solution was the Zemlyanka, a term the Germans borrowed, consciously or not, from the Russians who had been building them for generations. A Zemlyanka was essentially a dugout bunker, dug into the earth at least 1.5 meters deep, roofed with whatever timber, branches, and soil could be layered on top. The depth mattered enormously. Below the frost line, the earth temperature stabilized. Above it, you were at the mercy of the air. Inside a well-constructed Zemlyanka, even without any heat source, the temperature could be 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the surface. With a small improvised stove, and soldiers became extraordinarily creative about building those, it could feel almost bearable. Not comfortable, but survivable. And in that winter, survivable was everything. The stoves themselves deserve a moment. There was no standard issue solution, so men built their own from whatever the environment offered. Shell casings became combustion chambers. Metal ammunition boxes were converted into primitive furnaces. Pipes were fashioned from salvaged vehicle parts to vent smoke out through the bunker wall. The fuel was anything that would burn: wood from destroyed buildings, furniture stripped from abandoned villages, in desperate moments even vehicle fuel mixed with soil to slow the burn. These improvised heating systems were dangerous. Carbon monoxide poisoning killed soldiers who sealed their bunkers too tightly against the cold, but the alternative was freezing to death, so the calculation was straightforward. You managed the risk of the stove because the risk of the cold was certain. Insulation became an obsession. Soldiers stuffed newspapers, German propaganda sheets, Soviet newspapers scavenged from ruins, anything with paper, inside their tunics against their skin. Paper is a surprisingly effective insulator. It traps a thin layer of air and breaks the wind. Men wrapped their feet in cloth torn from anything available before putting boots on, mimicking, without knowing it, the principle behind the Soviet felt boot. Straw, when it could be found, was packed into boots and layered under sleeping areas. Hay from barns, rags from abandoned homes, strips of canvas from tents, all of it cycled into the constant project of keeping body heat inside the body. Officers who tried to maintain uniform standards quickly gave up. By December 1941, the German soldier on the Eastern Front looked nothing like the photographs from June. Here's something worth thinking about, and we'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. When a military institution completely fails its soldiers at the most basic level, warmth, shelter, the ability to survive the environment, and those soldiers improvise their way through anyway, what does that say about the individual versus the system? Because what happened in those trenches wasn't just survival. It was a complete, ground-up reinvention of how to exist in conditions nobody had prepared them for. Leave your thoughts below. But the story isn't finished yet, because the ground and the stoves and the newspapers were only part of the answer. The other part came from the enemy. The enemy had something they needed. And they took it. Not as a matter of policy. Not as an organized logistical decision handed down through the chain of command. It happened the way most real survival decisions happen, one man, in one moment, standing over a fallen Soviet soldier and realizing that what was on that body was worth more right now than anything the German supply system had managed to deliver in weeks. The Valenki. The padded jacket. The shapka, the fur-lined ear-flap hat that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Soviet soldier. German soldiers began stripping these items from Soviet dead almost as soon as the cold became serious. By November 1941, it was widespread enough that German officers were documenting it not as looting, but as a practical necessity they had no moral standing to prohibit. The Soviet winter uniform was, by any objective measure, vastly superior for the conditions. The vatnik, the quilted, padded jacket that Soviet soldiers called a telegrika, worked on a principle of trapped air insulation that the German tunics simply didn't replicate. It was loose enough to layer, light enough to move in, and warm enough to make a measurable difference at extreme temperatures. The shapka worked because fur, unlike wool or leather, maintains its insulating properties even when compressed or slightly damp. The Valenki worked because felt, unlike leather, doesn't conduct cold, it resists it. These weren't accidents of design. They were centuries of accumulated Russian knowledge about winter survival, encoded into military equipment. German soldiers, once they understood what they were wearing versus what the enemy was wearing, reached their own conclusions quickly. But equipment scavenged from individual soldiers could only go so far. The scale of the problem required something larger, and here the German army's relationship with the occupied Soviet infrastructure became critical. Warehouses, depots, collective farm storage buildings, anywhere that Soviet military or civilian supplies might have been stockpiled before the German advance, became targets not just for tactical reasons but for survival ones. Soviet winter clothing stores, when found intact, were distributed through informal networks that bypassed the official supply chain entirely. A company commander who located a cache of padded jackets didn't wait for regimental approval. He equipped his men and asked questions later, or didn't ask at all. Vehicles presented their own crisis, and the solutions were equally improvised. German engines, lubricated with oils formulated for European temperatures, seized in the Russian cold. Soviet vehicles, by contrast, used different lubricant grades specifically designed for extreme cold, and Soviet mechanics had developed techniques for keeping engines alive in winter that German engineers were learning about for the first time, in the field, under fire. Captured Soviet trucks were kept running when German ones couldn't start. Soviet horse breeds, stockier and cold-adapted, were pressed into service when German horses, thinner-boned, less cold-resistant, began dying in large numbers. The Wehrmacht was effectively cannibalizing an entire enemy military ecosystem just to maintain basic operational function. There is something almost ironic in the image. The German army, which had invaded the Soviet Union with such overwhelming confidence in its own technological and organizational superiority, now dependent on Soviet felt boots and Soviet horses and Soviet quilted jackets to survive the winter that Soviet planners had, in some sense, been counting on all along. General Winter wasn't just a metaphor. It was a strategic asset, one the Soviet side understood far better than the Germans had anticipated. And the cost of that miscalculation, the full, terrible arithmetic of what the 6-week bluff had actually produced, is where this story ends. The numbers don't argue. They simply state what happened, and what happened was catastrophic. By the end of the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Wehrmacht had suffered approximately 734,000 casualties on the Eastern Front from cold-related causes alone: frostbite, hypothermia, exposure. That figure doesn't include the dead from combat during the same period. It doesn't include the psychological toll of men who survived physically but carried the winter inside them for the rest of their lives. It represents, in raw statistical terms, a destruction of fighting capability that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully offset. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective not by Soviet offensives but by temperature. The German army that emerged from the winter of 1941 was fundamentally different from the one that had crossed the Soviet border in June, harder in some ways, hollowed out in others, and carrying a knowledge about war in the East that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. The institutional response, when it finally came, was too late for the men who had already lost fingers, toes, and lives, but it was real. Hitler's regime launched a massive public collection drive in December 1941, appealing to German civilians to donate winter clothing for soldiers at the front. Fur coats, wool blankets, warm boots collected from homes across Germany and occupied Europe were bundled and shipped east. The effort was logistically chaotic and arrived months after it was desperately needed, but it signaled something important: the official acknowledgement that the bluff had failed, that the 6-week war had become something else entirely, and that the army needed to be re-equipped for a reality nobody had planned for. The doctrinal changes that followed went deeper than clothing. German military planners, drawing on the brutal education of that first winter, completely restructured their approach to cold weather operations before the 1942 campaign season. Lubricants were reformulated for extreme cold. Winter camouflage, white oversuit uniforms that had been almost non-existent in 1941, were manufactured and distributed at scale. Training programs were developed to teach soldiers how to construct field shelters, maintain weapons in freezing conditions, and recognize the early signs of frostbite before irreversible damage set in. The improvised knowledge that individual soldiers had accumulated through survival was systematized, codified, and pushed back down through the ranks as official doctrine. The army learned. It learned the way armies always learn their hardest lessons: by paying for them first. What those men endured in the winter of 1941 sits in a particular place in military history. It wasn't the largest battle of the Eastern Front. It wasn't the most strategically decisive moment of the war. But it represents something that resonates beyond the specific context of World War II, the collision between institutional failure and individual resourcefulness, between the plans of the powerful and the reality faced by the ordinary person tasked with executing those plans. The generals had their maps and their timelines. The soldiers had -40 degrees and whatever they could find. And in that gap between the map and the ground, Between the plan and the reality, something remarkable happened. Most of them figured it out anyway. Not all of them. Too many didn't. The ones who survived carried knowledge earned at an almost unimaginable price, knowledge about cold, about improvisation, about the limits of institutional authority in the face of physical reality. They carried it into 1942, into subsequent winters, into whatever came after the war for the ones who made it home. And we carry it now, in the historical record, as a study in what human beings are capable of when the system around them collapses and survival becomes entirely personal. If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a detail you hadn't encountered before, a deeper sense of what that winter actually meant for the men inside it, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about history told at this level of depth. And if you have a question, a detail to add, or a thought about what you just watched, the comments are open. This kind of history deserves a real conversation.